Hello, this is a short guide from the Centre for Excellence in Learning and Teaching about writing questions for a multiple choice quiz. We have some step-by-step guides as to how to set up a quiz activity in Moodle. This is a companion tutorial to those, which discusses actually creating and writing the questions to put in your quiz. How can you structure them so that they will really get at what students know or what they can do without unfairly penalising or rewarding anyone? So with the help of this resource, you should be able to avoid some of the common logical errors in devising questions, and we're going to be bringing in research around that topic to help you. And we're going to touch on the idea of developing questions related to your discipline, which are really testing higher order student abilities, not just recall and repetition. And lastly, we'll look at ways to integrate quizzes into your module, so if students are unfamiliar with them as a way of demonstrating their knowledge, they can become more fluent. So we're going to start by looking at some examples. You don't have to understand the disciplinary concepts within these questions, we're just looking at their structure and how they're put together. So, as I said, you don't have to know about the science, but have a look at this question and ask yourself what's unhelpful about it. Try and answer it yourself. What do you find jarring about the way it's been constructed? Possibly pause this film and have a think, maybe jot down your ideas. You may have spotted several things that were unhelpful about that question, and do save any answers you've got, but I'm going to focus in on one thing in particular, and that's that the question is quite unwieldy, and that's because of the structure. The stem of the question, that question part, isn't posing a problem in itself. Students find it easiest to understand a question when the stem is the problem. Students should then think about answering that problem, and you provide potential answers to them. The focus is on that learning outcome. Do they know the thing? Can they do the thing that you're trying to test? In the example, the result of having not really a question as the question is that the answers are really wordy, because the answers have to be mini questions in themselves. This is very confusing. You want the cognitive load of how the question is put together to be as light as possible. Let the problem of the multiple choice quiz be the problem of your discipline itself. So here's a better way of phrasing that question. You've got a stem which focuses in on a meaningful problem, and then you're able to have concise answers that the students choose between. So here's another example. Think about what's unhelpful about it. If you're not from a science background, I'll just point out that the final sentence of that STEM question is the same as the previous questions that we looked at, if that helps you to work out what might be problematic about this question. Again, do you want to pause the film and have a think, jot down anything that occurs to you? So you might have noticed several things that were wrong or unhelpful about that question, and do keep a record of those because they'll help you to write better multiple choice quizzes yourself. I'm going to focus in on one particular thing, which is supported by research. There's a lot of extraneous contextual material in that question. Now you might be thinking that's useful, it'll prompt a student, it'll help them to remember what they know about that subject, but actually in a situation like a quiz, students are interrogating absolutely everything for possible clues. The more you include, the more it slows them down and may throw them off topic because they're looking for something, they're looking for a particular slant or perspective. Why else would you have included that piece of information? So try and pare your questions down to absolutely the minimum necessary for that particular problem to be solved. Here's another question. Pause the film if you need to and think about why this is potentially unhelpful. Why does it jar for you, even if you don't know the subject material? This one's quite simple. Negative phrasing in the STEM question really confuses students. You might be thinking, well, my students are smart, they can cope with a little bit of linguistic reversal and they'll need to in their working lives, but do you want to risk that at this point? If they misunderstand 2 questions out of 20, they're knocking 10% out off their possible attainment. And if you want to test their learning outcomes rather than their reading comprehension under pressure, make things as clear as possible. You might also want to be using the quizzes for something else, for example, to work out whether your cohort of students have understood all the topics that you've covered. So you definitely want to make sure that your questions are similarly easy to answer across the board. If you phrased 1 or 2 of them in a more complex way, then you might get false indication of whether your students have understood that topic area. So there's a handout available which sums up all of these points. Here are some more to avoid quite quickly. All of the above and none of the above formulations of answers really encourage students to guess. So if they know that A is correct and they have the option to choose all of the above, they might assume that the others are as well. Similarly, trick questions don't really test student understanding, and they make students quite suspicious of the rest of the test. Fill in the gap questions are harder to answer than straightforward questions. So the capital of Britain will be harder to understand for students than what is the capital of Britain. Seems simple, but it's an easy thing to avoid. And finally, do check that information in the STEM, the problem of one question, doesn't help students answer one of the other questions. See the example below. What animal is this? If they get through to question 5 and it's asking them which of these cats is the best cat, they'll know the answer to that earlier question. So far we've been looking at how to write the question, the STEM, the problem. For the rest of the session we're going to be looking at constructing distractors, and distractors are the incorrect answers that you offer a student in a quiz as alternatives. And these are some of the hardest parts of the question to write. So again, I'm going to provide some examples, have a look at them, possibly pause the film if you want a few seconds to do so, and think what seems particularly unhelpful about them. Particularly look at the answers, particularly look at the distractors. So what's unhelpful about the way this question has been structured, particularly those distractors? Pause it for a moment, have a look, and then I'll give you an answer. So the principle here is that all your alternatives, all your distractors should really be as plausible as possible. D, the room suddenly filling with nudes, is not particularly plausible. And for a variety of reasons, if I can unpack a ridiculous question in a logical way. The language is totally different. It's not as technical as the other distractors, and students are going to go for sciencey sounding language if only one answer has got sciencey sounding language or technical sounding language from whatever discipline you're working in. It's also, it's illogical. You could plausibly reach some of those other outcomes through logical means. The room suddenly filling with newts is not going to happen. And I've included this slightly daft answer because it is really hard to write 2 or 3 alternative answers. The temptation to put in something ridiculous is great, particularly if you're thinking that students might want to break halfway through the exam, but it's going to skew your results and it's going to break that trust that the student has that they are in a particular testing environment and that you're both, you are creating the most testingly interesting questions you can and they're participating in good faith. So yeah, make your distractors plausible. So what's unhelpful about this question? Slightly less obvious than the newts. Pause the film if you need to and have a think, and I'll give an explanation after that. Okay, so the problem here is that there's an overlap in terms of the areas covered by those potential answers. A is contained within C, B is part of D. This causes confusion in the same way that the all of the above or none of the above answers do. If a student knows that A is the case, they might be second guessing themselves, wondering whether they should hazard a chance that C is the actual answer. As far as possible, can you make it so that your alternatives, your distractors, are all mutually exclusive? So what's problematic about this final question? Have a look. It's not a trick question. Let's assume there is a video above which is giving them a particular scenario. Think about what's problematic about the question and particularly about the potential answers that you've been given. Pause the video, have a look. So these answers are very various in form. When you've got answers that aren't really parallel in form, students are going to start checking them. Like I mentioned earlier, going through every possible clue to see which is the right answer, not just relying on their knowledge or their understanding. They're going to be looking at things like the grammar, and how they're phrased, and that might distract them or it might give them an unfair advantage. You've probably got some ideas generated by those examples of things that you're personally going to avoid within your multiple choice quizzes. I'm going to sum up the ones that we've looked at specifically in my slides. So all your alternatives should be as plausible as possible. Mutually exclusive, so A should not be contained within C, for example. And they should be free as far as possible from clues about which of the responses is correct. So the grammar should be consistent with the stem for each of them. It should be roughly parallel in form, similar in length, using a similar level of technical language. Whether multiple choice quizzes can really test higher reasoning in your students. The questions, the examples I've given have been pretty flippant and rather simplistic. They've mostly tested basic recall or suggested they had. Many disciplines feel that multiple choice quizzes are unsuitable for their content. But it is possible to construct questions which test higher order understanding and reasoning in your students. So you can use them in disciplines with fuzzier content, as it were, things like the arts or the humanities. Any of these disciplines are going to have concepts that you want to test the understanding of, critical terminology that you want your students to grasp, and you can get students to apply these concepts and these terminologies to specific examples. Now, how you do that in your discipline is too difficult to go into in a tutorial like this. It will take time for you to think through, but I've got some examples. You'll be asking your students, for example, to interpret facts or evaluate a situation. You might give them something and ask them to explain how cause and effect is working with that scenario. You might want them to draw inferences or to predict results. You could give them a new example and ask them to either identify concepts within it or apply a concept to it. These are just rough outlines. I hope that they can help you to think of how to tackle questions within your own discipline. I've tried to come up with some questions from my own discipline, which was originally English literature. It's a discipline without many right and wrong answers, which really encourages students to ask questions. But again, it still has some concepts, some terminology, some theorists that I want students to be able to absorb and to apply in new situations. So each of these questions asks them to evaluate something, to have some knowledge of a particular text and some knowledge of the concepts or the theories that I'd like them to apply and work with. Finally, I want to touch on the idea of integrating multiple choice quizzes more into your teaching. If they're a totally unfamiliar form for your discipline, you don't want your student, when they're being evaluated, to face them for the first time. They may feel unnecessary pressure. So, I think one of the easiest things that one can do is to start using questions at the start or at the end or in the middle of your contact hours, a lecture or a seminar. This could be something interactive, possibly using digital devices, possibly using Turning Point, or it could be something very simple which is self-marked. Now, we know from research that testing on the spot and sometime later really improves student retention and makes them familiar with the material, but it also makes them familiar with the quiz format, so hopefully they'll be less daunted when they approach it. At a slightly more advanced level, you might want to set some more Moodle quizzes in between contact hours, but I know that that requires more tutor input and time. And if you're feeling very adventurous, you could get the students to write quiz questions. It helps them focus in on what is their discipline valuing, what are they expected to know. You can get some sense of what they think from what they write. Hope you found this useful. There are 3 further resources that you might find of use. One is the handout which summarises this small tutorial. One is the step-by-step guide to creating a Moodle quiz. And these are just 2 further readings if you want to look further into the research around multiple choice quizzes and what they're useful for, what they're suitable for in assessing students. Thanks very much.